listening to the Authorpreneur podcast, episode number 19. Welcome to the Authorpreneur podcast. I'm your host, thriller writer Amelia Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at ameliahay.com/podcast. Hello writers, are you struggling to write the second half of the second act of your story? You already know there's a midpoint and the dark night of the soul or the second plot point, but you're left wondering what to write between these two scenes. If this is a situation that's all too familiar to you, then this episode is for you. In this episode, I will discuss the most important scenes within the second half of the second act so that you can write a stronger and more compelling story. Before I dive into the episode, this is the 8th installment in my series on 3-act structure. If you just joined me on this episode, then I will link the previous 7 episodes in the show notes over my blog. You can find the show notes at ameliahay.com/second-act. Throughout this story structure series, I refer to the protagonist with the personal pronoun he. The reason for this gender is simple. My protagonist is male, and I've been writing the series since its earliest conception in 2013. So technically it's not a gender bias. As I'm writing the content for these episodes, I'm also thinking critically about my series and my protagonist, James Lalonde. So I hope this clears a few things up for you. As I researched this episode of the Authorpreneur podcast, I realised there are many different opinions when it comes to story structure. Now that I'm forcing myself to take a long, hard look at how I structure stories, I've realised 2 things about myself as a fiction writer. The first is I structure in a similar way to writing for film, and secondly, I give my characters a hard time. While they do have small victories along the way, I tend to rip away this success just as quickly as it's achieved. So I guess you could think of this as 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So why do I do this? 1 word, conflict. Story is conflict. Without it, it's all smooth sailing, and that's not a great read. Smooth sailing is boring. However, this storytelling technique is symptomatic of the genre I write in. For those of you who are curious, I'm writing in the crime thriller genre, and I have elements of action-adventure with a layer of mystery. Like you, as I outlined the story for my soon-to-be-released thriller novel Immunity, I struggled with the second half of the second act. I couldn't figure out what to do between the midpoint and the start of the third act. When I started outlining Immunity, I started with a few key scenes and fleshed everything out in between these moments. I knew how I wanted the story to start and end. However, when it came to the scenes between the midpoint and the second plot point, I did the only thing I knew how. In the second half of the second act, I amped up the stakes, conflict, and set James up for failure at the start of the third act. As I started outlining and later started the revision process, I realised that I accidentally got this right. And I think this was due to my earlier studying of screenwriting. So here are the 3 most important scenes you need to include in the second half of the second act. I want to point out that these scenes don't have to be a single scene for each story element. If you're writing a longer novel like I do, these story elements might consist of a few scenes per element. So the first one is a series of action scenes. You don't necessarily have to have, I know the title implies this, but you don't have to have just 1 scene for this. Sometimes you will have 3 or 4 scenes, or if you're writing something shorter like a novella, you might actually have 1 or 2 of these scenes. The second half of the second act must begin with the protagonist taking action and fighting back. These action scenes should span from 50 to 62% of the story. Just like the action scenes from the first half of the second act action scenes should mirror each other, but with one slight difference: a proactive hero. The emphasis of the story is now on the hero's sense of purpose and the fact that they're no longer dodging a series of things that merely happen to him. In spite of all this, the protagonist makes slow progress against the antagonistic force. However, it's still progress nonetheless. It's in the second half of the second act that we see the protagonist calling the shots and moving forward, even though he is not in total control of the situation. In these action scenes, the protagonist has lessons to learn and problems to face that will prepare him for what lies ahead in the third act of the story. So don't fall into the trap of letting the hero change too much after the midpoint, because he still has to go through the climax of the story, and that's also room for growth in the climax as well. Around the 62% mark of the story is where the reader expects something to happen, and this something is the second pinch point. Just a side note, I know I've mentioned the term pinch point before, but I haven't explained what it is or how it differs from a plot point. So what is a pinch point? A pinch point is any time that the antagonistic force resurfaces to remind the protagonist that his opponent is close at hand. Point creates an emotional roller coaster effect by keeping the reader on the edge of their seats. So how does the scene achieve this? By foreshadowing the events that occur in the second plot point or the Dark Night of the Soul scene, and thus serves a reminder of what's at stake for the hero. In the second pinch point, the protagonist is taking action towards resolving the story problem, and the antagonistic force has started to notice his success, but not for long. The bad guys close in, and the antagonistic force needs to regain the upper hand. Just a side note about foreshadowing, you may have to come back and layer the foreshadowing moments in after you've outlined the entire story. So don't be too worried if your story outline or second pinch point scene isn't perfect the first time. You always have time to go back and revise and improve on what you've already written. Inspired by the events in the second pinch point, the protagonist pushes forward in a renewed attack on the antagonistic force. These scenes are referred to as a renewed push and usually span from 62 to the 75% mark of the story. This series of moments need to give your protagonist a small taste of victory before it's ripped away at the start of the third act. Yes, in a sense, you're setting them up for failure, but these success and fail cycles give the hero another reason to keep fighting until the end, because what's around the corner is in fact their lowest point, almost a disappointing defeat, and he needs reference points to push him towards the end of the story. A series of action scenes, the second pinch point, and the renewed push are the three types of scenes you need to include in the second half of the second act of your story. So what should you do now? If you're stuck in the outlining phase, go back and highlight the key moments in your outline so far. Consider the lessons your protagonist needs to learn, your antagonist's reaction, and what needs to happen in the opening scenes of the third act. Then go back and add these moments into your existing outline. If you've already started writing the first draft of your novel and you're stuck in the second half of the second act, go back and create an outline based on what you've written so far. Go over this new outline and highlight the key story moments, those moments that keep your story going. If you don't know this already, decide on how your story is going to end. Once you know your end, consider what needs to happen in the second half of the second act for this ending to make sense. Are you struggling to write the second half of the second act of your novel? I want to hear from you. Let me know by coming over to the show notes for this episode at ameliahay.com/second-act and let me know in the comments section where you're struggling and the steps you're going to take to improve your story. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Authorpreneur podcast, where I'll discuss how to write the Dark Night of the Soul scene in your novel. Thanks for listening and happy writing, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur podcast. If you're new to this podcast or want to be notified about more episodes just like this, then click the subscribe button right now. I'm your host, Amelia Hay, and I'll see you next week for another episode.